I think it's super important to know your identity labels and to know yourself. Those might be the same thing, and those might be a little bit different. I've talked about earlier in this discussion about knowing where I came from being very important to me, but also knowing how that makes people perceive me, helping me kind of remove the shackles of fear. It's an ongoing process, but like basically being less concerned about taking up space and less concerned about certain things, and also understanding that within the complex South Asian political and ethnic mix that I also have a lot of privileges, just like I've also grown up sometimes being a minority. So, I mean, knowing how all these things work definitely allows me to assert myself, to understand what is missing and what I need to do to go out for it and to hold on to it.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Greetings, folks, and welcome to another edition of the podcast. If you are new here, if it's your first time listening, it's so great to have you along. And just to let you know what you're about to get yourself into, my name is Tyler, and I'm a composer, a radio broadcaster, curator, producer, the list goes on and on. But mostly all you need to know is I would simply say that I am a maker. I really like to make things. And on this podcast, I sit down with other creative people to discuss their journey, process, philosophies, basically whatever it is that makes them who they are and goes into the stuff that they make. And if this is not your first time here, well, just want to say welcome back. On this episode of Music Maker, I'm joined by Shruthi Rajasekar. Named by The Guardian as a composer who will enrich your life, Shruthi Rajasekar is an Indian-American musician exploring identity, community, and joy. A 2023 Jerome Hill Artist Fellow, Shruthi draws from her unique dual background in the Carnatic or South Indian classical and Western classical traditions to create intersectional music. As a soprano and Carnatic vocalist, Shruthi has performed and recorded in numerous traditional and experimental settings. In this conversation, we take a deep dive into Shruthi's intercultural identity and work, and a significant part of our discussion is just Shruthi sharing her journey as a musician with roots in Carnatic music and how that has melded with her work as a Western classical composer over time. We also talk a bit about issues of gatekeeping in the contemporary music field, how composers might consider placing more emphasis on process rather than product, and what experimentation means to her in her work. This was such an enriching conversation for me personally, and I really hope you get as much out of this as I have. As always, just a bit of business here to share with you before we jump into this conversation. One of the simplest and indeed the number one best, all-time greatest way for you to support this podcast is by doing what you are doing now. Listening to this episode, listening to earlier episodes, re-listening to earlier episodes, sharing episodes with friends for them to listen to who you might think would be interested in these conversations, and then also following the podcast on your favorite streaming platform, and that'll ensure that you get the newest episode as soon as it's released and pushed straight to your device. Also, an equally impactful and equally free way to help the Music Maker podcast is to leave a rating, and if you can, a review if you have time, if you feel inclined. The more of those that we have, the more visibility the podcast has, and the more we can grow. And I think we can agree that we both would love to see that happen. So keep listening. Leave us a rating. Leave us a review. I'd love to share those as well on the podcast. And thanks so much for taking time to just do all of those things. Now, on to my conversation with Shruthi Rajasekar. Well, Shruthi, it's so great to sit down with you today to learn about your journey and artistic process and philosophy. I think your music is simply spectacular, and I love the way you incorporate your identity into it. So just want to say thank you so much for your time, just hanging out with me a bit.
Yeah, thank you so much for calling me for this. I'm so excited to get to talk to you. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. So where we like to start here on Music Maker is as far back as you're willing to share, as you remember. And that's basically, what is your earliest artistic memory? And this could be as a composer, it could be as a musician, but I'm really curious about kind of when your interest in composition started, especially.
It's kind of hard to remember a time in my life without music because I grew up in a musical household. So my mom principally is a Indian classical musician, but also her work handshakes is what she likes to say. It handshakes with other traditions. And maybe it was out of necessity it was born that way because she was an immigrant in the upper Midwest 25 or so years ago. So in order to basically be able to practice her music in this setting, she had to not only do what she does really well, which is traditional, but these kind of collaborative experiments with other genres. So that's how I certainly got introduced to like new music and this idea of music with different idiomatic contours, I would say. I wouldn't even say rules with that.
Sure, yeah.
And it was a very, very rich way to grow up. I think for a time I kind of thought that everybody did music in the world because all of her colleagues were our family friends and my surroundings were always music. And I think the other really cool thing it gave me was an appreciation for different styles. So I think generally with kids, there's sometimes, if they're at a new music concert for the first time, they might find it kind of uncomfortable or unfamiliar. And so they might be laughing and doing all the other things they do when they're trying to understand, what is this? Like, what's going on? Like, how come they're playing on the other side of the instrument? How come they're doing all these different kinds of things? But I got to grow up with that exposure. So even though it was definitely different from my baseline, which was Indian classical music, I think what my mom taught me best was an appreciation and a willingness to be open to things I didn't necessarily understand. So that was kind of the ethos that I was raised with and definitely had an impact on me when I eventually decided to become a composer.
So other than Indian classical music, what kind of other musics did you encounter as a child? What did you hear like in your household that made you gravitate towards being a musician?
That's a great question. So certainly, of course, South Indian classical music, Carnatic music was the baseline. So even Hindustani music was something that a lot of other Carnatic music students wouldn't have grown up with. But my mom took me to all of those concerts, even when I was 3 years old, 4 years old. And some of the other patrons were kind of like, why are you bringing this young child to this concert? Is this going to ruin our experience of it? But I think they quickly realized that I was totally enthralled with the music. So it wouldn't I wouldn't make noise and interfere with their experience, which is why I'm really passionate about like making musical experiences that are in fact accessible to younger listeners, because that's certainly how I got into it. But then beyond that too, my mom was working with a Chinese pipa artist here in Minnesota. So Chinese classical music was something I was introduced to very young. And my brother's music lessons actually happened in our house. So he was learning Western classical violin, and my mom was sitting with his violin teacher and like learning more about sight reading notation. That's actually how she got versed in Western classical, like the tradition of scores, basically. So that was also in my ears because that was happening in our house. And her rehearsals with new music artists in town, like there's a cellist, a wonderful cellist, a clarinetist. So actually the really cool thing for me is I learned what the cello was, or I learned what the clarinet was in these settings, not because of my school music teacher telling me that the clarinet is a wind instrument and that kind of thing. But actually I heard it first and then I learned all the technical stuff about it afterwards. So I think that had a really big impact on me. But I would still say that my point of reference was Indian classical music, in the sense that when I eventually started learning Western music theory, it took me a while to connect the dots, I think, because I was sort of hearing most things from that frame of reference of Indian classical music.
It's really interesting to me because, when we think about Minnesota and the Midwest, we think of predominantly white society and culture. But, do you feel like your mom was creating this space for herself and for you and your family and all these collaborators, or was it more like this was already there and she found herself into it that way?
Some of her first collaborators were a white tabla artist who had spent time in India learning, and a very famous American poet who was working on a translation of poetry by Mirabai, who's princess from kind of like the medieval era of India. And he was creating English translations of this. And so she was composing the music that was the foundation for this. Or there were a couple new South Asian theater and South Asian dance companies in the 1990s that were starting in Minnesota, and they were collaborating together. And she was composing the scores for these productions. So that was also my first introduction to the fact that performers and composers, they don't have to be separate things in the first place. So there was this interesting context of like the culture was starting to grow and very quickly. So, but it is like a very predominantly white setting. So what I would say is that, yes, she, like if I look back, she definitely created a lot of what we have today as the scene here in Minnesota. But also something that was really special about Minnesota is that they were welcoming and curious, I think.
Yeah, nice.
And that's not necessarily what you would necessarily, like sometimes people tend to think of Minnesota nice being sort of a closed off, standoffish kind of sense of politeness. That really wasn't my family's experience, at least in those early years too. I think they found people who were interested and curious enough to maybe not necessarily know what she was doing, but still invite her to come in. And I think she was the kind of presenter that could bring people in, even if they'd never heard a gamakam, which is like the bending of the note in Carnatic music, or they'd never heard this drone-based music. They were still curious enough to give it a shot. And I think she did the rest of it with her magic.
Oh, I love that. So did you in fact start doing music in school, or was most of your music making growing up in this Carnatic style?
So I started learning Carnatic music like kind of officially at age 4. And you should know now that my mom only takes students ages 7 and above. So I might be the reason why.
Nice.
I was actually learning with a bunch of friends, and my friends, like often happens, they were interested in other things. So they all pretty quickly dropped out. So I actually wasn't formally learning between the ages of like 5 to 9. But I would sit and listen to all of her classes. In those days, her studio was in her house, and so she was teaching there. So I got to hear that. At the same time, around age 6 or so, I started piano because my friend was learning piano and I wanted to do everything she was doing. And I also, we had music class in the elementary school, and that was definitely very impactful. And we got to play with like rain sticks and things like that's what I remember from that age is like my music making. So I think when I got to 5th or 6th grade, which was my first introduction to really having to see vocal music notated in Western notation and have to like read that, by then I was already in sort of the advanced music class in Carnatic music. So I had been reading some with piano, but I was kind of faking my way through my early piano lessons with the sight reading.
I know that feeling.
I was really an oral musician, and I was really lucky that the Carnatic music tradition gave me that grounding in that sense. So I definitely feel that Carnatic music was very much my first language of music, and I was pretty steeped in it by the time I came to a point where I actually had to, say, read a harmony vocal line, and I couldn't just kind of copy what the teacher had sung the first time through. That was in 6th grade that I was like in for the shock of my life, that I had to like figure out something else. I had to be the harmony alto line, for example. I mean, it was it was daunting, but I think by then music had its hooks in me, so I wanted to rise to that challenge.
At what point did you actually put notes on a page? I mean, I'm assuming based on what you just said, being such a aurally forward musician, I mean, I'm guessing that a lot of your early compositions might have been that, like just kind of playing or singing. But when did you start doing composition in the Western sense?
That's a great question. I recently found like a lot of sheet of papers in my old piano bench, like that I just like stuffed in there. And I guess they are my earliest compositions. But even the ones that I didn't use Indian notation for, I've just written like letter names. Like I haven't used a staff. I haven't used manuscript paper in these early things until like late high school. I think I was very intimidated by it. I think that this is something that our world could, like our genre could do a little better work with, because I think that there is a gatekeeping element to it. It's not that sight reading actually is that difficult. I recently did a workshop totally for Indian musicians on how they can use only their Indian music knowledge to access. We ended up they were like singing along to Stravinsky's Firebird by the end of this 1 hour. Like it was very immersive, but it also, I just eliminated certain things that I found like superfluous to their like knowledge for that setting. We just honed in on the most important aspects of treating. We talked about the staff as a graph, basically thinking of it that way. And then everybody was able to follow along. And like, it was so exciting to be able to present that to people who were either like me, like trying to find their way through these two genres, or there were older people in the room who are never going to go study Western classical music in their lives, and they're not planning to. They just want to be able to understand it a little bit more when it comes on the radio. So anyway, that experience reminded me of the fact that I often felt like I was sort of drifting at sea without a life vest sometimes with Western classical music, because there is sort of this attitude, if you don't know, like, shame on you. And whether it's this kind of information, or even like, oh, you're not familiar with Tchaikovsky's piano concerto, like, what are you doing with your life? Like, why even try to enter this field? And like I said, because I was so into music and so curious about music and taught to be curious, that didn't really stop me. But I definitely was, say, embarrassed to tell a teacher, I don't really know what's going on right now. I don't really understand. On the one hand, it made me like work very hard on my own to kind of develop an analysis system that was my own language, like this hybrid way of understanding. Like, I would describe chords and swaras, which are the kind of like the combination of solfege and ABC, like the Carnatic music swaras. But I think it also, it can alienate another kind of person. Like, for me, it was kind of galvanizing to be like, I am going to figure this out on my own terms. But I think there are things we can do to show that it's not actually as mysterious as you think it is. And I think that some people in our industry actually, they like the mystique and they like the exclusivity. And I think that's going to be the final thing to knock down when we're talking about breaking barriers.
Yeah, I mean, I know nothing about any Indian classical music except for like a baseline encounter here and there with like raga and stuff like that. But what you're saying about the gatekeeping nature of classical music is such a universal thing, I think. For like, with me, I grew up in a rural part of Kentucky. My parents aren't musicians, and so I'm kind of with you. Like, my love of music came from other places, and then I found myself having to learn what classical music was, kind of in real time as I started high school band and going to school for music and undergrad, and especially like going into school for composition. It was like just all crash courses like along the way. And so I really appreciate what you're saying, that it's like, how can we keep our love of music that we develop as a child through all of these kind of like almost intimidating circumstances, unless you do grow up, steeped in classical music, Western classical music in this case,
Absolutely. And curious, so you were like primarily in the performing world before you entered composing? Was that your entry, was like learning an instrument?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I was, I don't know if I've talked about this much on this podcast, but I have talked about my background a little bit. But so for those who have been listening along the way, I apologize for any repeat information. But at any rate, I think I was kind of with you. I was a very aural kind of musician growing up. I didn't have access to lessons until I was maybe 12 years old, and those were piano lessons. I didn't start playing music until middle school band, playing the trumpet. But I was always gravitated towards, like, for instance, my grandma had an electric organ in her house, and I would just kind of like play by ear, like music I heard on TV or like music I heard on the radio. My parents listened to 60s, 70s, 80s classic rock and 90s country music. And, that was kind of my musical exposure up until I was in middle school. And then at that point it was like, oh, this is like, music is like a lot more than what I know, but
that's incredible.
But yeah, the playing by ear thing was like, that's always something I've been good at, and something that's kind of like saved me in a lot of ways as a musician, and especially as a composer, like being able to auralize, I guess, stuff in my head and just kind of like pluck it out on a piano,
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a fantastic, what you're describing is like a very well-rounded music education, actually. But I think that of all the gate-kept parts of classical music, I think composition might be the most, which is funny because from what you're describing, and it kind of resonates with my background too, is like, we're always creating. Like, when you went to the electric organ and you're noodling around, right? That is actually composing, and that's creating.
Right.
But somehow the classical world wants us to, or traditionally has wanted us to keep it as in some sort of like like as some sort of ethereal act that just like descends from the heavens and like comes to you in a moment. I mean, of course, there are huge exceptions to that. Like, I think there are three reasons I'm a composer. I was able to become a composer. One was my mom from the start taught us basically that improvisation and composition are two sides of the same coin. And so she would have her students, this is unusual even within Carnatic music, even though it's an improvising tradition, she would have her students, we would learn the first 14 exercises that were supposed to, kind of the etudes, the very first exercises. And then she'd ask us to write the 15th, basically.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Just to see, what kind of patterns are we absorbing and, how creative do we want to get with that. The second reason I'm a composer is that my piano teacher, actually, so within the Western classical world, she allowed me to like play her the things I was coming up with on my own. Sometimes I was working on those at the expense of practicing what I was supposed to be practicing, but she didn't mind at all. And I told her I'm going to be entering this, song contest or these other things. And she's like, well, let's hear it. And, she'd give me her feedback and her input. And the third reason was that because of the exposure to the new music world, those people also were targeting me and saying, hey, do you want to, we're doing opportunities for young people. Do you want to try your hand at it? And that was probably the world that was most intimidating to me, because I was like, I can't necessarily follow what you're doing orally all the time. And I definitely don't have the chops to read what you're playing. I'm really interested in it, but I don't know how to enter a world like this, the experimental world, we'll say. But they were so encouraging, and they were after me on my case to say, hey, we're running a contest, a young person's contest. Do you want to enter it? And I finally did enter without telling my mom, because I was so scared of this experience. And in my entry, I misspelled the word chord. I was 12 years old, so I really should have known better, but I was like, C-O-R-D is what I wrote and everything.
Sure. Yeah.
I sent in a bio about the math contest I had won, because I had 0 musical accomplishments. And I think I also put the wrong email address or mailing address. So anyway, they had the hardest time tracking me down when I eventually had been like the winner for it. But the fact that those people were willing to stand by me, even though I didn't know how to spell the word chord, and so many other ways that I didn't feel that I had the information to do something like that, but they encouraged it. I mean, those are the champions, right? Like, they went into a community like mine and were like, we're going to find people like this who can be interested in this world too. And we're going to develop their curiosity. So even though I'm trash talking the classical music world, I have to call out the people who have been doing this kind of work for a while, not just since summer 2020.
Yeah. Oh, I completely agree. Completely agree with you. I guess before I ask my next question, I'm wondering, and maybe the answer is like there's no difference, but would like a composer in the Carnatic tradition, is that different than a composer in Western classical music?
It's kind of funny, because the Carnatic music world also reveres its older composers in a certain way, and particularly non-living composers, I think. When I say that, it's people who've composed material that gets performed again by other individuals is what I'm going to refer to as what they are calling compositions. Because actually, like I mentioned, a lot of a traditional concert is improvised. Like, anywhere from like 30 to 60% of the concert is improvised, which is a huge chunk of material. And I very strongly advocate, whenever I have the opportunity to, in those circles, or if I'm talking to journalists and others in India, I really try to speak to why that is also a composition and why that creativity needs to be celebrated. And it's Mano Dharma Sangeetam, which is the term for that, which is a really cool term, actually. Sangeetam means music, Mano means heart, and Dharma means like duty or rules or boundaries. So that's the word for improv. It's like creativity within the structures that you make. Mano Dharma is the heart of Indian music. Often that's what's said, North Indian or South Indian. But at the same time, as an oral tradition, I think in some ways the practitioners are rightly protective of pre-composed material too, because that is what gets passed down. And say, for example, I think I'm the 10th or 11th generation descendant in the Guru Sishya tradition. So this is not like birth lineage, but this is my teacher's teacher going back several generations, is one of the greatest composers of Carnatic music, Sri Muthuswami Dikshitar. And interestingly, our versions of some of his compositions are different from the mainstream ones. And so if I went to my guru's guru who isn't living anymore. But if I spoke to her, she would defend her versions by saying that, we've received them in this lineage and we have to protect them. So the big thing this comes down to is, do we change lines that we are taught, or do we try to maintain that continuity from the 17 and 1800s? So I understand why they also make a distinction there between improv and composition. What I would love to see celebrated more is the 20th and 21st century composers, because there are a lot whose work we love, whether it's Sri Lalguri Jayaraman, Sri M. Balakrishna, or, even more, there's tons of people working outside of what the equivalent of the white man in Carnatic music would be, probably the brown, privileged class, privileged caste, South Indian man. So people working outside of those spheres, I want to celebrate their work more. And there have been some movements to do it, and some of those have been received with a little bit of backlash. So that's an important thing to call out too. So just because it's a non-white tradition doesn't mean that everything is that's happening there is perfect either. They're figuring out their way through it. And for example, there's a type of work called the pallavi, which is a single line of composition that has a ton of improv on top of it. And not only is 90% of the piece improvised, sometimes that pallavi itself has been composed by the artist presenting it that day. So I think we could celebrate that more. I think there are already festivals of that kind of music happening. But I think the main thing we could do is when we present it to listeners, we could explain that more to them, why that's such an extraordinary thing that they've composed it, for example. That was a very long answer to a very short question.
No, I love it. And is it fair to say that it's almost comparable to like jazz? That's kind of what it reminds me of. Like there's
standards and I think that's a great way to think of it. And I think there's, in the same way there's respect for standards, there's really a deep respect for the kritis and kirtanas, which are like the main compositions. So I think, I think it just comes down to my personal take is I always love concerts where the artists give more information and they explain kind of what's going on. And I think that's a very simple and easy way to like let the audience in on, hey, this is the part that was handed down to me, and this is the part I created. And for that to really like be part of the experience that we share with audiences.
That's great. So, okay. So my question that I ask everyone that I think you just beautifully set up is, when was your first encounter with a composer? And for you, I'm going to ask a Carnatic composer and also a Western classical contemporary composer.
So the funny thing is, like I said, when I was growing up, my mom was, especially at that time, composing a lot. At age 2, the lullaby that she was singing to me, she had written for this theatrical work in 1998. So I think that in a way it was always around me, but importantly, because it was so normal, I didn't maybe celebrate that enough. And so probably the first time I met a composer from the Carnatic tradition was Dr. M. Balamurali Krishna, who is no more. And he sang in his concert one of his pieces, but I'd also heard it on a CD before. And so I think that was a really cool experience of kind of like maybe like the equivalent of going to a Britney Spears concert or something. You heard it on the CD and then you got to see it live and then realize it's that same person. So there was something very special about that. And then I guess the very first Western classical composer, I think it's my mom's friend and an amazing, wonderful new music composer named Jan Gilbert, who was working with my mom a lot. They developed suites for vina and orchestra, vina and string quintet, string quartet. They did so many interesting collaborations together in the early 2000s. That might have been the first person I met who was not a performer also, to my mind.
Okay, yeah.
That was an interesting distinction because there were a lot of musicians we were working with in the new music world, especially with mom's collaborations with the ensemble Zeitgeist. They were all performer composers in the new music world. So that, and Jan Auntie is also a performer, I think, of piano, but I had only known her in the composer. So that was a new experience of a person whose job in rehearsal was to be looking at a kind of a piece of paper. In this case, it was a full score, but I didn't realize it, and studying it. And I was like, that's an interesting contribution. Somehow that was even more, I think also conductor was a very interesting thing to see because we don't have that usually in Indian classical music. So it's like, you're not actually doing anything physical right now, but you very much are. So those were two really interesting roles to encounter for the first time. Yeah. I haven't thought about those memories in a long time. Thanks for bringing that up.
Oh yeah, of course. My pleasure. It's really fascinating to me. Everyone has such a different answer to that question. And I think your perspective is even more interesting, because the composer can mean different things, in the work that you do.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Can you walk us through, kind of like connect the dots, what your journey through maybe academia looked like? What led you to, did you study composition in undergrad? And when did you know that you wanted to pursue your craft as a career, not just like going to school for it?
So early middle school, I was composing a lot. I was only sharing those bits and pieces with a few select people. I entered this one contest, but before that I'd written a lot of music, and after that I wrote a lot of music, and I was just doing it basically for myself. I think sometimes I would show it to my mom, and I think everyone in my household was unfortunately forced to listen to all of it. But it was really a thing for me. It was my private thing. And so I was out there singing and developing and growing as a performer. And then this was my world, when I was in a bad mood or a good mood, sit at the piano and create. And it wasn't just with my hands. I was creating with my voice and all sorts of things, but it was kind of just for me, and that was very special. So again, I think it was these new music people who coaxed me out of my shell, like around age 15 or 16, to write kind of they were commissioning my mom, and they were like, well, why don't you write another piece? And I think they intended for us to kind of write it as like a response to each other. We wrote them totally independently, but they actually got the titles are like in conversation. It was a very strange moment that happened. That was an interesting one, because I remember I brought in whatever I'd written, and the new music artists were like, and so where's the rest of the piece? And I was like, oh yeah, I'll bring that to you tomorrow. And I was like, I haven't written anything more. They felt like there was something more needed to fill it out a little bit texturally, but I didn't have those terms. I didn't have that understanding. And so I was on the fly. I was like, I don't know what's missing from this piece, but I'm just going to add a bunch of other ingredients and see what happens. But that was a very cool experience. And that was another instance where it was kind of played publicly, and we were really workshopping it and creating it together, right? They told me to bring the second part of the piece when there wasn't a second part. I had to frantically come up with something. So I think all of that started to solidify in my head that I maybe want to start sharing what I was working on. And a hugely transformative moment for me was late high school. One of my mom's friends, my mom and her, they gifted me notation software. And the reason this was so cool is not because I still wasn't really using manuscript paper, but I had playback features. So I played around with that so much, of like throwing in a bunch of sounds. Now I could do things beyond my piano abilities, because those were pretty limited in the first place, and hear it back. And so one of my first contests that I entered, that I did not get anything for, was this piece I'd written where I hadn't actually put in any lyrics. And it was a choral composition for a choral competition. I hadn't put any dynamics. I hadn't put in anything. I was like, these are just cool sounds that line up together. And I'm sure that those judges were like, what the heck did we just receive? Especially in those days too, you didn't have choral pieces that had 0 words. That was just not done, not done at all. But maybe because I came from this kind of found sound way, by the time I started learning the rules of like what you should and shouldn't have in a score, for example, it was too late. I'd already decided to develop in a different way. I think I'm really lucky that things developed at the time that they did, because I think if I'd learned or been forced with those rules a little bit earlier on, and conventions basically of what a score should look like and have, I think it would have kind of limited the creativity a little bit. But my life definitely changed. My last year of high school is when I took theory really for the first time, Western music theory. I had learned the chords in piano, but I had promptly forgotten them, like Roman numerals. I was like, I don't like this system. It doesn't make sense to me. Tossing it out the bin. So when I finally came to Western music theory, that was the first year in my life I didn't compose anything original. So like my first song was age 4 or 5. So you can imagine like, that was a lot of years to be flexing my creative muscles, even though most of the things never were heard. And I absolutely loved that training, because at that point I was in a position where I could I really had a very strong Indian classical music theory grounding. I was actually starting to teach. I started teaching Indian music that year of my life too. So I was ready to receive that level of Western music and be able to put it into my own terms. And so first my theory teacher would laugh because she was like, you're writing all these ragas in, and then you're going in and filling out your 4-part Baccarat. Like right. There's a very strange order of operations going on here, but it made sense to me, and it really helped. And how I finally got back into composition after that year of overwhelming amount of theory was I did an arrangement, basically broke all the parallel fifth rules or whatever. And then I was like, all right, I'm ready to start creating again. So then early in college, I was writing all the time. I was writing voraciously, and all of it outside of my coursework. So I was taking the music theory sequence I had to, but I actually didn't even know that I was going to major in music. So I went into college thinking I wanted to do a dual degree, always knowing I wanted to study music, but not really sure that I wanted to pursue it as a career, despite the extremely rich background and environment I was growing up in. Somehow I think maybe because I got to see the life of like what a musician is daily, which is a lot of work.
Oh, right.
And, my mom actually, she's fantastic that way because she was my music teacher principally for Indian music. So she was very good at maintaining boundaries as a parent. And she never would tell me to practice, for example, which I wish she had told me more of that because I would have progressed faster and I would have gotten more information. But she was really like, if you want to do this in any regard, the drive has to come from you. Even at age 5, if you want to do this, you have to practice. I'm not going to tell you to practice. And that carried into the decision of whether to be a musician or not. She never said anything about it one way or the other. Her friends, some of them advised me, though, especially ones who had known insecurity in their lives and had maybe overcome it, but they were really, especially those two who didn't come from necessarily the same privileges that I did in terms of educational or even economic privileges. They were like, you are getting the chance at an education in another field. Why would you spend your time majoring in music? Why don't you get a degree in something else, which is very common also, especially in India. People get degrees in other things and then they work in that field and pursue music for a while until the music takes off and they quit that field and they go into it. To them, I was really like, I'm not even sure I'm going to pursue this as a career, but I really want to study it as much as I can. And I want to learn as much as I can. And when I went and visited the school I eventually attended, Princeton, I only went to the music classes. I didn't even bother sitting in on any other ones, or I only met the music teachers. So I think the signs were always there. Like there was at one point I had a scheduling issue where I looked like I couldn't take music in my first year if I was going to pursue the science track that was my other interest. And I was like, oh, I absolutely have to take music. So, I think that the seeds were there, even if I didn't recognize it. But still, the decision to become a professional was not actually a decision. It was kind of accidental. I was creating so much music, but I didn't have a composition. The way my school was structured, I didn't have a composition teacher for a lot of it. So taking these music theory classes and learning more about music, doing a lot of performance. But there was no one to really show my compositions to in those initial years. There used to be an undergrad composer club, but it was kind of defunct during my first 2 years there. And so I was writing all this stuff. And finally, I think I got the courage to show it to my choir director at college and just say, what do you think? And he gave me some great ideas. And then it sort of started organically that I was like, no one's going to really take an interest in what I'm doing compositionally. There's a lot of focus at the school I was at, for example, on the grad students. If I want to do anything with this, I have to be the driver of it too. So I did 2 things. I started entering lots and lots of contests, just using them as kind of internal deadlines for me, because there was otherwise, how is it going to get finished? I was writing all this stuff, but I was doing it on top of my coursework. It was just kind of there. So if I sent it in for something, I had a brief to write to, and sometimes strange brief to write to. And that kind of gave me some ideas. And the second thing I did in a parallel sense is that I approached the older performers in college and said, will you read through this? And will you sing it or play it for me so I can kind of hear it and it's not just on my computer? So that experience was incredible for me because it taught me basically what you need as a professional musician, which is create your own things. Don't wait for someone to give you the opportunity. Just do it. Just find the people. And I couldn't always pay them, so I'd buy them breakfast or something, or find other ways to entice them to be willing to give this a read through for me or even perform it. So 2 things happened sort of simultaneously then, is that those like hundreds of contests I entered, I like happened to win a couple, which those included mentorship with a composer, which was really cool. And then I was getting live feedback from the performers too, like actual feedback from them, as well as just like hearing them do it, of course, was transformative, as you know. And all of those, I think, built the confidence for me to actually go to my school and say, hey, can we restart the composer club? And hey, can we get like a grad student, undergrad student thing going? And there were some wonderful teachers and professors who were willing to drive that. I mean, I have to give them credit because they had to do a lot of work on their end to set that kind of thing up. But that's actually how I met Emma O'Halloran when I was a senior. She was my grad student mentor in college and gave me a couple composition lessons too. And
that's awesome.
And I think they're continuing now with that system of undergrad, grad. I think there's a lot more of a relationship, but I think it was just that like maybe the undergrads hadn't spoken up enough about it, or maybe there had been some students, but they had graduated. And so it was just kind of dormant at that time. But I think, you know, despite the fact that I grew up with a mom who was like, who modeled leadership and made her own opportunities and did all of these things. I think despite all of that, my own personality was a little bit too shy, especially as I got older and like scared to say, this is what I want and this is what I need from you. I had friends younger than me later who were saying that they were asking for funding from the university to go to new music festivals. And I was like, what? Like, we can do that? Like, I never applied for those festivals because I thought they were too expensive for me to go to. So like, I mean, sometimes I think I was putting my own limits on where I could ask for help. I think I never really put limits on what I was creating and what I was doing. I think that's where I just let myself be exactly who I am and go kind of as wild and out there with the ideas as I wanted to. But especially as I got older, I think I became more aware of being sometimes in Western music spaces the only person who looked like me. And I think because of that, I imposed artificial limits on myself on like, how much help could I ask for? And how much could I just say, hey, I really need this support to do this kind of thing. I didn't ask for help unless I was like guaranteed that whatever I was going to launch would be a success. Like I would do all this research and work before I asked somebody to chip in for funding or something like that. So I'm glad in some ways that there were those constraints. Like I remember I got to my second degree and I had lined up all the opportunities to fulfill the 35 minutes of music I had to write for the portfolio. And then the first day of class, they were like, here, you can just sign up to get a workshop with the BBC singers. And I was like, what? I could just put my name on a list. Like there were, I mean, it totally like overwhelmed me and was baffling to me. But I actually think that the fact that I couldn't sign up for those things right away in my early years of wanting to be a composer forced me to step out of my comfort zone and ask for help, or just like have the drive to do what I wanted to do. So I'm actually really grateful that I didn't go to a conservatory, for example, or other setting that would have been like, hi, here's your opportunity. Just sign up for it and take it.
Yeah, it's incredible that as different as our backgrounds are, I totally relate to what you're saying. I mean, I had to I didn't study. I had no option to study composition as an undergrad. But I was very much interested in doing that, and I just had to like figure out how to do it. And I mean, all the things you're saying about like, who do I ask for help? What do I apply for? Like, oh, I just won something. That's cool. Like, there's it's I don't know. I think there's so much emphasis put on composer pedigree, for better or for worse, that it's like, I don't know. There's been moments in my own life where it's like, I kind of wish that I did have that background. But then again, I think so much of who I am as a person, as a composer, relies so heavily on not having that, and that's what's given me so much drive to do what I do as a composer and other aspects of my life. So yeah, I think that's so cool to hear from you as well.
Yeah, I sounds like we have a lot in common, so it's just really cool to get to talk to you. So thank you.
Oh, of course. Okay, so at first, when you were talking about undergrad, I thought you were still in Minnesota at that point, but you were at Princeton.
Yes, so I did my undergrad at Princeton, which was also a last minute decision. You're seeing a theme probably through my life, of like kind of accidentally falling into things that have worked out wonderfully. Yeah, this is the funny thing, is my parents are immigrants to the upper Midwest. They actually lived in a few other places and countries in Europe before I was born. I was born here, but they lived elsewhere. So it's kind of weird that I had this extreme attachment to Minnesota growing up, but I really did. One of the reasons I loved choir once I got used to it was the group music making aspect of it that kind of, especially here, we really emphasize the erasure of the individual, sometimes in unhealthy ways. But when I was growing up, I loved that. Like, I think that really filled a part of my soul, the jointly working together to make music thing. And it's not really about the individual anymore, which is different from Indian music, because there are like the kind of like jazz, there's like the soloist moments. So I think I was very keen on staying in the Midwest. I applied to a lot of schools that had really strong choral programs in particular. And I remember my choir director telling me in a way that she was kind of warning me against that, even though she was actually a product of a lot of those really rich Lutheran choral traditions, because she said, you know, your voice is bigger than that, basically, is what she was telling me in a very technical sense. But I think she was speaking to me also, because I remember I visited one of those schools out in Wisconsin. It was fantastic. I loved the program. I loved the people. The dean of the school is an ethnomusicologist. So it was, you know, really fantastic. But it was like small town Midwest, like, for lack of a better term for it, super white. Like, I would have been like the only student of color at the school. And that didn't bother me at all. My brother, who's now a sociology professor, he's older than me, and he was like, you know, you really want to make the decision of where you're going, you know, very carefully. And I knew I wanted to be at a small school. So he was like, you know, you want to find a place where you can spread your wings. And that means culturally too. But I was really tied to the Midwest. And when I got into Princeton, it was definitely a privilege. And I was actually going to say no, even though my financial aid was better there than my state school. So I'm grateful for my parents, who probably were internally like freaking out my decision making. But again, they were sort of leaving it to me. They were like, visit the school and decide. And I think what actually made the decision, I met the choir director during the visits, and we had this very strange, beautiful conversation where he was debating, he's British, and we were talking about the British colonial rule in India, which is so not a soft launch in this conversation. And somehow I was defending the British, and he was talking about all the ways colonialism was bad. And obviously I mean, I don't defend the British's rule, but I was discussing basically the merits of, you know, for better, for worse, how that changed the course of India's path. And so the fact that I could have that conversation with the choir director, and basically my mind, I think, was just being exposed to new ideas. And I don't think it's that Princeton necessarily gives that any more than any of the schools I was looking at. But what was different is I was meeting people who did not grow up like I did. I think that was the main thing. And so that is what influenced my decision to go to the East Coast. And I'm really grateful for that, because I got a lot of paid opportunities, as they paid for funding for me to, say, study abroad and try all these things in new places, new languages, new things, that I think had to do with this. What I was telling you earlier about my personality was that I was a little bit scared, I think, to go out of my comfort zone, despite the fact that the music I was interested in was always pushing boundaries. I think my personality wise, and I think also being like kind of, again, looking sometimes like the only person like myself, I felt a lot of pressure to tuck myself in and kind of assimilate in ways. And that's what I was really grateful for, to go to the East Coast, is because I think a lot of people there don't really care what other people think of them, you know, whether it's the speed at which they walk or what. There's not a lot of accommodation in a way that's sometimes bad, but I think is also admirable in a sense too. It's a different way of thinking than the Midwest, for sure. So I did eventually return here after all of my studies, but I returned here, I think, hopefully a little bit more open to different ways of thinking.
Well, I think also what you're talking about with this professor that you met, the choir director, mm-hmm. I mean, anytime I've had students, I mean, a big part of that conversation is less about like, you know, certainly there's like schools that you go to that offer like name recognition to, mm-hmm. you know, wherever you end up afterwards. But I think so much about like being a music major, taking music classes, for example, versus, you know, being a math major or any other kind of like non-arts degree. You know, you're going to school for the people that you study with, not necessarily the school that, yes. You know, at least that's what I try to coach people on. You know, some people might disagree, but
I think that's a great point. And I also, that's a huge reason why I value like sort of the non-conservatory, like pro-liberal arts model for me, because I think it's sometimes my non-music coursework that has had the biggest impact on the music that I write now. Like, I think it just opened my mind in a lot of ways. And there was always this interdisciplinary feel to everything I was learning, which I think is really important for musicians to have. So I might not have known everything I needed to know musically when I graduated, although I got a lot of exposure while I was there. But I think it definitely just made me think differently than I know I did when I was 17, 18 going into the school.
Tyler here, interrupting this conversation just briefly to let you know that you can easily help power the Music Maker podcast and Loose Leaf Transmissions Network in a big-time way by becoming a Patreon subscriber. By becoming a Patreon subscriber, you're supporting these fantastic conversations with makers in a real way. And one of the perks to being a subscriber is getting early access to episodes each week. And I've also launched a Patreon exclusive feature called The Workshop. It's sort of like an audio journal where I share a little bit about my own creative process as it pertains to some current composition projects that I'm working on. Anyway, yes, that little bit of support on the Patreon, in fact, does go a long way in helping me cover the cost of some tools that I use to produce this podcast. So I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber by following the Patreon link in the show description of this episode, or you can log on to looseleaftransmissions.com/support. I really appreciate you getting back to me. And back to today's episode. So you have 2 degrees, is that right, from institutions in the UK?
Yeah. Yes.
So what led you to pursue education across the pond, as we say? And can you talk a little bit about how your time in the UK, what that's meant to you and your career?
Definitely meant more than I could have ever expected professionally. But here's the funny thing. I think you're going to really start to see a pattern about my behavior, which is that things that scare me, I force myself to do. So I studied abroad in the UK. I studied abroad 3 times when I was at Princeton. And the 3rd time was a semester for my junior year at the Royal College of Music in London for voice, actually. Even at that time, I was just starting to get the confidence to tell people that I like to compose. So I went into the practice room in London and I would compose every day instead of practicing my Italian arias. So I think that was the sign of what's to come.
Love it.
I had kind of a tough time in that semester, partially like big city, not small town, but like suburbanite girl in a big city, very overwhelmed by like navigating the tube and stuff, which is so funny when I look back. And also I think culture shock for sure. Britain is different and there are a lot of things I love about the UK, but they have a different relationship with race. And I think I encountered some of that particularly because I was younger and more naive about it maybe at that time. So I actually, it wasn't necessarily my favorite time that I had there. I think I struggled. I think I grew a lot, but I definitely struggled. So it's kind of funny when I look back, like, why did I decide to also go to grad school there? This one experience I had. And I love the US, so why didn't I stay for grad school? But 2 things, I got an amazing opportunity with funding to go over there. And the second thing was that I felt that I hadn't necessarily explored all the hues of British life. So the first thing I did is I researched this program in ethnomusicology at SOAS, University of London. Now, SOAS is a very different institution from the Royal Music Schools. It's the acronym, we use the acronym because its full name is slightly problematic, School of Oriental and African Studies. But I guess, that O what it stands for means something slightly different also in the context of Britain and that school, because it's a school really committed to decolonizing. And it's really a fantastic institution. The professors there are all dedicated to that. So what was really cool was for me to go study Indian classical music, something I knew as a practitioner, from the perspective of an academic institution that is committed in the 21st century to decolonizing and really questioning British colonial legacy, but was actually originally founded as a school to train colonial officers to be better at colonizing. That's its original founding. The library is one of the best in the world because they have all these resources that have made their way, or some might say were stolen. I mean, you can take umbrage in a lot of senses, but the school is very aware of their history and very aware of raising the next generation of really deeply thinking activists are a lot of the attendees. So the music department within that school, you couldn't even take a class in Western classical music there. Super interesting setting. People, like, the closest thing you're going to get is that there's a piano in the in the music practice rooms, but everyone's using them for like Cuban jazz. Like, no one is using them for their Western classical canon rep. So that was super cool to be exposed to, even though I was pretty sure that I wasn't going to go on to do a PhD in ethnomusicology or anything like that, just to, again, make me that kind of thinking artist. I think it was really fantastic. And then I went on the other end of the spectrum for my composition degree, which was back at a conservatory. But this time I chose Manchester for that, Royal Northern College of Music. Manchester is a super cool city, very different from London, very different history when it comes to the northern part of England. And the school also has like a pop music department in there too. Yeah. So like popular genres, essentially. So their attitude towards composition was also very expansive, even within the conservatory. So I definitely got to flavor of all these different places. I will say, though, professionally, that was not my expectation when I went to the UK. Like, I was just there to study and kind of, again, immerse my brain in all these different things, and then come back and kind of try to figure out what's next. I didn't have a huge plan. I was thinking maybe a PhD program, whatever I could do to delay working in the real world was kind of the plan. So what I didn't expect was getting to like make the connections professionally that I would now. I go on to visit the UK pretty often. I would say that a fair amount of my projects are UK based too, even to this day. So what happened when I was there was that another grad student at Princeton, actually, Ninfea Cretwell-Reed, whose work you might know, is a fantastic composer. She sat me down a few weeks before graduation and said, I heard you're going to the UK. I'm also moving back there. And, what schemes are you applying for? I was like, scheme? Like, right. That sounds like nefarious. Or what does that mean? And she couldn't believe that I was like so disorganized that I had not even looked into a single composition opportunity there. I thought I just had more to learn, that I wasn't ready to be composing out in the world. Again, all these artificial limits I was putting on myself. And she sent me a couple schemes, and all of them I applied for, and I did. And those were incredible. Because it's a smaller country in a way, the classical music scene is, I think, easier to enter than it is professionally in the US. I think we just have so many centers here, which is cool, because then you can be making music where you are, and I can be making music where I am. And neither of us have to be living all the time in New York, for example, to be making music. That's a huge positive. But over there, it's just so closely linked that for a long time after, every opportunity I was getting was directly the result of one of those 3 schemes that I did in the UK, which is kind of mind-boggling if you think about it. Like, this person knows this person.
Right. And when you say the word schemes, because this is like a word I came across at a certain point where it's like, schemes, what does that mean? But that's like call for scores and, opportunities like that. They're like mentorship programs or early career composer programs, basically. And they just call it a scheme. I still don't know why that's the word, but program might be a better sense. I kind of thought of them as apprenticeships. That was my attitude towards them. And so I think because I was studying full time, it was like also great for me to have this outlet, and I was, in a privileged place where I could do an apprenticeship because I had a funded program that I was in through the Marshall Scholarship that allowed me to basically be doing, say, non-paid work, for example, if that's the nature of the scheme, which isn't always the case for artists. So again, deeply lucky in that sense. And that's something we have to, I guess, examine going forward with these, even though these programs are fantastic, how can we support people during them if they're going to do those programs full time? But they were, it was wild that if I look back at my first several commission opportunities, they were all as a result of something with that scheme, with one of those 3 schemes that I did. So one was a choral scheme with the National Youth Choirs of Great Britain. And that's I think that was my first encounter with your music, actually. Yes, it was one of the songs that was released. I was going to ask about that, yeah. Yeah, so we wrote this, I wrote a couple songs for them, and they made an album at the end of it. I mean, how lucky is that for composers to get professional recordings of what they've created? Another scheme was with this amazing new music group called Safa in Manchester, which has encouraged so many people with their Compose 4 schemes, where they would get like 24 people in a year. They would give these to, which is a lot of people. And then there was a scheme with the Royal Scottish National Orchestra too. So, which was, also a great opportunity to get to work with orchestra. So these are just, they're just available for people to apply to, even if you're not British, for example. So that was so cool. Yeah. So after your studies in the UK, because I've talked to a few people from the States who go overseas to study, get a master's, and even go on to get a PhD,
Mhm.
and they talk about how like this is my way of like long-term staying in Europe, for example. Was
Mm.
that ever a thought of yours? Like, were you kind of once you were there, you're like, I kind of like this. I want to keep on studying here, find a way to stay here, or was it pretty much like you got these degrees from these two schools, and then you decided, okay, I'm going to go back home?
I'm gonna peace out. Actually, so the funny thing is, so the second time I was in the UK, I loved it. So compared to the first time where I was kind of having a hard time, I absolutely adored it. I think maybe there was the confidence of being slightly older, slightly more comfortable with the discomfort of things. Like being okay with being uncomfortable. I think that was part of it. Um, and I loved both London and Manchester. I thought they were fantastic cities. And what was something that was personally exciting is that the South Asian population is a much bigger percentage in the UK than it is here. So even though they've got this complicated past with, say, my great grandfather being forced to serve in the British Army, for example, things like that are very tangible and real. I still loved a lot of the UK, and today especially, it's a very, very interesting country. One thing that was going on when I was a student was what the conservatives called the austerity period. So it meant that for most of the time, and ever since I left too, students have been able to stay on for a few years on their visa. They cut that when I was a student. So you had to get another visa if you wanted to stay beyond like 2 months after you graduated, basically. So I'm glad I had that experience because it definitely opened my eyes to what international students have to go through here in this country, which I was not familiar with before. And you've maybe had encountered this now with some of our music colleagues. If they want to stay on, it's a very difficult process for
Oh
them
yeah.
to do that. So I'm glad I had that experience in that sense. I mean, I realized the privilege I've had as a U.S. American in this country when I was forced to like renew my visa and things like that. But I did have a few friends who artist friends who jumped onto like what they call a global talent visa because it's I mean otherwise you have to be basically have a full-time employer sponsor your visa, which is not what freelance musicians have access to necessarily. So that was one situation that was there. But the other thing was I guess I was not ready to give up on the US
Yeah.
despite the fact that it was the Trump presidency while I was over there. And, despite other aspects of this country that are very muddled right now, and it's kind of unclear what our path forward is, I felt that there was still a lot more here I wanted to explore, particularly this whole like different artistic cultural centers that we have around the country. I am open to the idea of, say, living in New York or another place at some point for sure. But I was really excited to come back to the Midwest and kind of see what it feels like now, say 12 years on, what that experience is like to live and make work here as a full-time artist. And I'm so glad that I did because, first of all, Minnesota has tremendous support for the arts, definitely financially and also culturally. It's like a really important quality that we have here. So that's been really, really cool. Secondly, I've gotten to, thanks to my projects, get to learn about the different regions of this country a little bit more and getting to do projects in different parts here. I mean, it feels really, really fulfilling and there's a lot more that I've got to learn. So I am open to the UK and the Europe thing, but I definitely wouldn't move there out of like fear of what's happening here, which I think is why some artists, rightfully so. I mean, like, when it comes to healthcare and other things, it's a lot harder here in a way. I loved being on NHS when I was in the UK, so shout out to universal healthcare. But I think there's so much amazing stuff happening on the ground, and you and I probably agree on this, given again that we're not just in New York. There are so many cool things that are happening in local communities,
Mm.
and I love. I feel like it's a privilege that I get to glimpse some of that as a composer in Minnesota or a visiting composer in other regions of the country. So right now I'm really excited about having the chance to access all of this and still be connected to the UK. Like I said, I go over there a couple times a year. But yeah, we'll see. Maybe if some big things change, maybe I would want to live over there too.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I love being a composer in the Midwest. I mean, I grew up in the South,
Right.
South-ish, and
Southish.
now, and I'm still only Midwest-ish now. But yeah,
You're in
I feel
Ohio, right? Or
yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah. We live in Cincinnati,
Cincinnati. Okay.
but yeah, it feels like nothing is an uphill battle. It's like I imagine in like talking to friends in New York City, it's like sink or swim, right? But here
Mm.
it's kind of like I can. You can be a composer anywhere. and it's much easier to kind of get things going, like curating your own concerts and stuff like that in a smaller ish city, mid-sized city even. So I love when I like talk to people who are champions of not the coasts. I feel pretty strongly about that. So.
And to be fair, I haven't lived in those places, so I don't really know. But I agree. When a few times I've had the chance to adjudicate things that were like Minnesota and New York based, and the resumes of these New York artists, wow, I mean, they're incredible, but they've had to, as you say, sort of get to that stage in order to thrive in, I guess, because of just the numbers over there, they have to do all these things in order to. And I think you made a hugely important point, which is that here in the Midwest, as an artist, you can sort of just be. You don't always have to be doing and like grinding the next activity. I think it's possible to just sort of exist.
Yeah, I feel like I can take more time with my music. Like
Yes.
I can craft it the way I want to, rather than, checkboxing jobs to get money to pay for my life. I don't have to worry about that. Mostly because I have a day job. But even if I didn't, I think it would be much easier to survive and make the music I want to make here versus, having to figure out how to pay a few $1,000s for rent, for example.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, which is a huge deal when you don't have safety nets, which is how a lot of artists are. So.
Right. Exactly. Kind of shifting more into your artistry and craft and philosophies and process. We've talked a lot about these two worlds that you live in, and you meld them together in your music so beautifully. So
thank you.
I'm wondering, you've kind of touched on this already, but I want to ask you specifically, when and how did you begin incorporating your background in South Indian classical music into your Western classical compositions? I mean, was this always something that was present, or did you start doing this like rather intentionally at some point?
In a lot of ways, the hybridity has always been there, because the way I think, the way I write down music is coming from both places sort of at once. I sometimes joke that the Indian solfege, the Carnatic swaras, I'll use the actual term, are Sari, Gama, Pada, Nisa, and we shorthand them as S, R, G, M, P, D, and S, just the first letters of each of those swaras. And so sometimes I will not be clear, and if I wrote Ga, Da, or G and D of the Western alphabet, I mean, that's how much they are linked on my scripts, that I am switching back and forth between them pretty seamlessly. And there will be a little bit of confusion of, did I mean Ga, or did I mean like G pitch? I mean, like there's
right.
to the point where it's like, wow, I got to figure out a better system if I myself am getting confused. The other thing is that I'm still really that kind of oral musician, and I often create a lot of voice memos, and I work in a place that intertwines the written and the recorded pretty seamlessly, in a system that doesn't probably make sense to many other people. If I needed to be, say, if I was working with an engraver earlier on in this like process, I think they would find that pretty confusing of like, what is she communicating? So even if I have to share a draft or something, like I will have probably exhausted all of my ideas as much as I can and get them as complete as possible to share them, because they just won't be comprehensible to another person, because my mind is so melded in that way. I guess the one thing where intentionality comes in is if I've got phrases, or really comes down to the gamakams, those either ornamentations or oscillations that you get in Carnatic notes, like nowadays there are some really precise ways you can notate that, and you can ask people to do that. But is that the best way to elicit that kind of sound from a person? So I'm going to consider, what is their background? Do they have an oral background? Can I send an audio recording demonstrating how that sound needs to be made? If they don't have an oral background, or if they don't have exposure to Indian classical music and aren't interested in becoming more exposed outside of just my piece, maybe it's not the best thing for me to write them that phrase. So that's where sometimes I have to put certain limits on the creativity of like, what are the circumstances that I'm writing for? Who am I writing for? Who are the real people I'm writing for with this? And then how does that sometimes, I mean, I think often those quote unquote limits lead me to new solutions that are interesting to figure out how do I convey what I want to convey from this melded place, but still has integrity and still has something challenging for me to face. So I think it's funny that sometimes I've had not a lot, but I've had a few analyses of pieces of mine done kind of externally, and I think they might be like, oh, well, this one is more Indian, this one's more Western, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, I mean, that's a little bit humorous to me because they're both coming from a like deeply mixed place that I couldn't necessarily see those divisions that they're seeing. Sometimes I think it requires us to challenge, what do we think of as Western? What do we think of as Indian? But other times, those are their interpretations. So I think that, they are valid in their own sense.
Yeah, I mean, would it be fair for me to ask you, like, can you put a percentage on how much of the time you implement Carnatic idioms into your music? I mean, is it always kind of there? I mean, do you ever write like just strictly Western classical music without any of that?
I think it's probably an assessment of the process versus the product question, because I definitely think there are pieces of mine that are so deeply in, say, a kind of a Western 20th century harmonic language, which is a difficult thing to define what that is. And secondly, a lot of like minimalist composers were inspired by, say, Indian music. But anyway, that aside, I mean, I think they could be analyzed completely with Western theoretical language. Like, I think that that's the result. But the process for me probably still was very, say, swara based. And I just have this kind of harmonic swara approach, I would say, which doesn't exist in Indian music and doesn't exist in Western music. It is definitely like a combination of the two, of harmonizing these Carnatic swaras.
Sure.
Yeah. I don't know if that answered the question, but
yeah, I think so. My first guest on this podcast was my composition teacher from grad school, Baljinder Sekhan.
Oh, okay, awesome.
And he is half Indian, and so I wasn't planning to ask him about how his Indian heritage might affect his music, but it kind of came up, and he was basically like, "Yeah, I don't know, I don't think about it." So it's like interesting to hear that contrast. But he also told this story about how he was commissioned by an Indian pianist to compose music that kind of used those idioms, and he said, he used these kind of raga based harmonies and scales, but it was on a piano, and he's like, it was kind of like me. It was like halfway in between. So
I love that. I love that. I think that's fantastic. I think that there are times where those kind of commission structures can really, that intentional approach can really make something rich. And I want to definitely be clear that with every project, I'm researching a lot, including researching this tradition that is part of my blood. Because I mean, it's kind of a joke now that Indian musicians are always talking about how they only know one drop of the ocean of rasana and only one drop of this great tradition. I mean, to the extent that I had SOAS professors who were like, it's traditional for an Indian musician to say that, as a disclaimer before they talk about anything. And they were kind of critiquing that attitude of respect, which I don't agree with the critique because I think it's beautiful, actually. But anyway, that aside, there's so much for me to learn about Carnatic music to the extent where I have encountered, very rarely, but I've encountered a few Western musicians who are like, yeah, I know this, I know that about raga. And I think that's kind of funny because I was raised with this whole like humility towards the tradition, and there's always more that we got to learn. But I mean, it's this interesting thing where something can live deeply within you, and there's still a lot that you've got to like learn and interface with. And there's a lot of cool things you can find when you are intentional. So I don't want to like dismiss that approach too of being very deliberate about how. And I think especially like there's a few South Asian composers who haven't gotten the chance to connect with their musical heritage until later in life, and say they got to go to South Asia or something like that. I really admire that, actually, because I think for me, because it lives so deeply in me, there's a lot of instincts that goes into that kind of composing, and a lot less like identity crisis in a way, because it just kind of is. There isn't much that I can force it to do this way or that. So I deeply admire the people who've learned about it later in life, and I'm very grateful, and I feel I definitely got a privilege with getting exposed to that because of my mother so early in my life.
You mentioned just a bit ago about how like the considerations of employing these idioms in your music, like depending on who the performer is. I mean, what kind of response have you gotten from, let's say, Western classically trained singers, maybe in a choral setting? How have they responded to your employment of idioms from Carnatic singing in your music? Because I know you have one choral piece specifically that it almost seems like a study of those techniques.
Yeah. Well, if you're referring to Ghanem, I've actually made the tricky decision to like not make it available very openly, in the sense
Okay.
that it's kind of a conversation we need to have if you're going to do the piece, as well as you need to have like, I kind of put in, I don't know if this is the best boundaries to put in, but I put in this caveat about you need to have like a residency with a Carnatic vocalist for a couple weeks if you're going to do this piece. If you can you dedicate that kind of time? And I've almost reached the place where, because I've had quite a few publishers who want to say take that piece onto the market, I've almost reached the place where I don't make it available because it's hard for people to dedicate that kind of time to it. And I'm kind of okay with that because, for me, I learned a lot writing it. I learned a lot with the premiere and then a subsequent performance by another ensemble. And I think it's actually given me a good attitude towards all of my compositions, that if someday I decided that they don't need to be out in the world anymore, like not maybe to be so precious about them and be like, oh, I want people to sing this piece. But I think also like, I think it's really important at the same time, I feel, for composers to hear different interpretations of their music. So it's a very fine line that you walk between, okay, this is creative interpretation, and then we also need to have like cultural respect here too. And yeah, it's tricky. And sometimes I get good ideas from people who don't have any cultural connection to where this is coming from, or where it's primarily coming from. That's the other thing. It's always melded in a way. But it's a tricky thing to make. And yeah, I was discussing this with a South Asian musician recently about like, if you discourage people from doing this work unless they can do it perfectly, many of them might decide to just leave it off their programs. This kind of, not just our piece, but like in general, stepping outside of their comfort zone. So I totally understand the need to, to be open in that way and to be welcoming to and invite people in. At the same time, if you've got recordings out there, or say things that the performing artists consider final products that are really far away from what the tradition is supposed to represent, where have we as composers kind of failed in that? If our mission is to expose people more to these worlds that we love and adore and have studied. So I suppose if there were a way to make things more okay as works in progress. I mean, it's so hard because so much of like a performance it's the final thing that you're sharing with people. Right. Or a composition, it's the final version that you've sold on your website. I mean, people would probably revolt if you were like, I'm selling you the score, but it's like not finished.
Right. Why?
Yeah, exactly, right. But I think if there was somehow a way to make things more of a dialogue in that sense, and less of like, this is the finished thing, and this is the definitive version of it, and we sang it this way, so this is how it's going to be. I mean, I don't know. Like, I really don't know what that would look like, but I think it's something we have to start imagining, because there isn't gray space otherwise for people to like kind of get it wrong, but still want to improve, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is interesting, not even from like implementing like traditional music into contemporary practice. I mean, it's like just contemporary practice in general. Like, what if it was more like what you're describing? I mean, that's interesting thought.
I mean, I don't want to sound like too wishy-washy on things that need to be clear, but I sometimes think about this when it comes to like, when people are talking about cancel culture, and let's just acknowledge that there is a very like harmful narrative that like, oh, people shouldn't be canceled, or like they shouldn't be held responsible for what they say. Like, I think people need to be held responsible for what they say and do. But I also wonder sometimes about like room for growth for individuals. I wonder, I don't know what that looks like, because if anything, our world is even more public facing than it ever was before, with people putting out 30-second reels on topics that are like definitive opinions. And like, there's a lack of process right now. It's all about product. It's all about that content creation and putting things out. But I don't know. I'm not sure what in progress looks like in a public setting. Maybe it can't be. Once people see it, maybe it's automatically a thing now, and it can't just be an undefined thing that's developing. I mean, it can't just be it can't just be growing. It can't just be in the chrysalis. It has to be born. It has to exist now. I mean, maybe there isn't a way. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on this?
I mean, I totally hear what you're saying about like everything is product with no process. I mean, it's just like crank it out, get it out there, like, and then like it only lasts for like a few hours before the next thing overtakes it. I mean, I really, really loathe that. I mean, that's like totally antithetical to who I am and how I work. But I think also that lends itself to a lack of nuance, which is what you're also talking about, like with this piece of yours. And there's a nuance to it, and there's a nuance to cancel culture, like you brought up. I mean, everything has nuance, and we're consistently being funneled into this world of like everything is black and white, like everything's a binary, and you have to pick sides and like do one thing or the other, and it's like, no, there's room for shades here. But I'm not really, I'm kind of just going on a tangent here. I'm not really qualified to speak of these things, but that's my observation.
Well, first of all, I think that you are qualified about it because in addition to the many roles that you take on as a composer and a curator, you also have this podcast, right? Because I think this is probably hopefully to try to get at more like what the making experience is, not the what is made, but the making, right? I guess the only thing that just came to mind as you were talking was like plants. So like plants are always growing, right? And changing. And sometimes they're like dying if they're under my care, but that's still the process of change. I don't know, if almost to be like, instead of being like, this is my piece, this is my finished piece, or this is the piece we performed, the finished performance, instead to be like, this is day 8 of day 223 in this plant's growth. And it's looking like this. And there's some places where some leaves are not doing so healthy, but it's also grown tall. Like, I don't know. I mean, and to treat a concert or to treat a piece as like version 25 of 100 to come. I mean, I don't know. This is probably getting a bit weird for listeners, but
no, the listeners love it, I think. But yeah, I mean, I've talked with folks before on and off this podcast about this idea of why do we put so much focus on the finished product when, I look back at older pieces and I'm like, I wish I could like make updates to this, but it's recorded and commercially released. And, if people play it, they're going to reference this recording. And if the music is different than the recording, they're going to be like, WTF, what's going on?
Exactly. All hell will break loose.
But yeah, I totally wish that there was room for what you're describing. Maybe it starts with us. I don't know.
That's true. Maybe, we need to be the first ones responsible for that. And I also will say, like, sometimes pieces definitely do feel like of their time, and maybe that's what we're doing every time we write something new, is we're just still trying to get at something that's elusive, but each piece is a new attempt at it. But it is very strange, especially when I think about the fact that I have kind of fallen into this career in the most beautiful way. It's strange to me sometimes that people are playing things that were in some ways maybe more exercises of idea, like growth and stretch for me. But hopefully it doesn't feel like it has to be the be all and end all for them too, right? If they're playing a full program, this is just one piece and one link in that. And so maybe there is already the roots for feeling like we can grow as artists in everything we do, and that nothing is finished, and we're always just trying to do this more and more.
Yeah, totally agree. We haven't talked much about your performer hat that you wear.
Yeah,
your singing hat. But I'm really curious to know, like, how does your work as a singer, both in Carnatic tradition and Western classical, because you mentioned like practicing your arias, which is like kind of a funny thing to hear in this conversation. I mean, how does that influence the music you write, and how does being a composer influence your work as a singer?
I think that composing has made my mind as a performer more expanded and permissive too of what's allowed. Something I'm really excited about as a performer right now is that I'm on the precipice of exploring worlds and sound making that I haven't before, because I grew up in two fantastically rich but pretty clear traditions of like what they are and what they are not. I think a lot of my life as a vocalist was, I'm singing this, I'm singing this, I'm singing this, I'm singing this. And sometimes I'm doing a concert where I do both. And it's very difficult technically to make that transition between singing as a soprano and then singing in the Carnatic tradition, the registers are very different, the techniques are very different, the ideal sounds very, very different. But in some ways, I'm definitely poised to be a person who sings and vocalizes in different ways, because I grew up with the understanding that two sounds were the ideal sound, at least two, which I think is the important thing that as performers we need to grow and accept, is that there are so many ways to make sound and there is no one best way to make sound. So that's definitely, I think composing has only broadened my mind in that sense and allowed me to feel like I don't have to just exist in traditions, although the traditions have given me so much. Sometimes I sing rep that I've written myself, and I'm like, God dang, why is this so hard? But also, truthfully, I sing the whole way while I'm writing. It's such a part of my creative practice to be making and doing. And I've been trying to give myself permission to do that on other instruments a little bit more too. Like I was last year when I was writing this orchestral piece for young players that was combining like a middle school orchestra, string orchestra, and middle school band program was the project. Yeah, it was a super fun project in a lot of ways because the kids wanted to choreograph the piece I was writing in like 3 different styles. So I had to like tailor my music to their demands. It was awesome to work with kid bosses. But I pulled out my 4th grade recorder. And then one day when I was in rehearsal for another project with fantastic new music artists and they'd stepped out, I like played at their vibraphone without asking to test out the parts that I'd written, actually. And that was scary, but really good, because I was like, oh my God, I can't play recorder or vibraphone. But just the act of putting myself through the mechanics of it, I think has been super, super valuable and something that I wish we could do more of. But it also just frees you up from getting so stressed out about what you're writing, because certainly when I was playing it, I was playing wrong notes. So like, what did it matter which notes I put down in the first place? Like it's the experience of it that matters, especially if it's kids, but even if it's adults. And I think the other thing too is, in general, like the embodied experience, I think really, really opens up the creative mind. And so when I'm stuck, I really try to do that more too, whether it's walking or singing or playing the 4th grade recorder too.
Yeah. I wish I still had my 4th grade recorder. I
can ship you mine if you want to use it like a sisterhood of traveling pants, the traveling
just
plastic recorder.
Share around our recorders that
exactly composer circle of recorders. That's I'm sure the people we live with would love that. Yeah.
So one of the questions that I ask everyone that's kind of open-ended, but I'm really curious to know with everything we've been talking about, what would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice, or even like your compositional philosophy in a way?
I think curiosity has been there from the beginning and continues to be really important. The more I write, the more curious I have to be. I think flexibility is a huge aspect of not only my creative practice, but something I try to keep implementing in my life. I think that's something being a composer has taught me, is to be more flexible and go with the flow. I'm trying to balance that flexibility with a certain element of rigidity. And why I use that word is that it's been so important for me, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, to like protect my time for creativity. My mom always likes to say this field is like water. It will flow into wherever you let it flow. It'll find any crevice of time and it'll take it over, and it's beautiful but overwhelming. So I've definitely experienced that a lot, especially as a full-time freelancer, is the balance of time with this. But also, the irony of all of that is that when I look back at pieces, some of my best ideas came when it wasn't the time I had carved out for composing. But I also know that idea wouldn't have come if I hadn't sweated it out on very bad ideas for a long, long time before it. So I think all of this I'm trying to teach myself more grace too, more grace towards the people I work with, and then more grace towards myself. And I guess more grace towards that elusive muse of creativity too. And knowing that sometimes I kind of have to coax it out, and sometimes it won't be there at all. And you kind of have to build it out of that fallow field. So I suppose those are the pillars: curiosity, flexibility, rigidity, and grace.
I think those 4 things too are you can apply those to anything in your life, which is what I love about them. I think about all those things that you just mentioned. I think about that, but not just in my music, but in the life I live. We just did a little traveling, and how do you, traveling and being curious while traveling is a very easy thing to do. Maybe, at least to me. But also like being flexible, because you have to be flexible when you travel, but also it's important to have like a structure to it. You can't just like be in a foreign country and hope for the best. And so I think, I'm applying it to one specific thing, but I think it's really beautiful that that's what you do in your music, but it's like, I could see that kind of touching everything in your life.
I think I definitely, for me, a lot of my creative practice, I'm linking it with like my spiritual beliefs, I guess, which when I say spiritual, I mean like what I'm hoping I'm philosophically applying to the rest of my life. Yeah. I definitely want to be clear that I fall short of these goals, both life-wise and creatively, all the time. But I think those are, if you're maybe rather than pillars, those are the things I'm reaching for rather than what truly is upholding it. Those are my aims, I guess I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. What is a piece of music or a song or a book, a piece of art, even an experience you've had in your life that's kind of changed the way that you look at your work, kind of changed your life, your creative life in many ways?
I'm going to answer with like something that's kind of all of the above.
Sure.
So I read Art and Fear. I don't know if you're familiar with this book.
No.
It's a fantastic little book. Art and Fear. The subtitle is something like Observations on the Perils and Rewards of Art Making. I read this book and a few others related to process and craft, like famous ones like Bird by Bird. One of our fellow composers, Dale Trimbour, has a book out called Staying Composed, which is a really nice read. But I read these books, all of them, when I was on this really special residency in northern Michigan that was all about actually spiritual reflection and how does spirituality relate to creativity. And I think both the specific experience of reading Art and Fear, which is all about like creative doubt, basically, and how do we live with it and how do we put ourselves through it day in and day out and why do we put ourselves through it? That experience plus like experiences that led me to meditate on the beach at Lake Michigan. I think those were like kind of like mind-blowing things. At the same time, as I was reading Art and Fear, I was reading, I think the author's name is John Donahue, who writes about like spirituality from a Christian perspective, but a very open-minded one. And I'm not Christian, but I found it really interesting. And he talks about echoes that we hear. I think the book was, one of them is called Eternal Echoes. And it's a religious text, but I felt like that was the act of composition for me, was like you flinging something out there and it's resonating, literally sometimes, but it feels familiar in a way too, or it feels like something you've always known, or more importantly, has always been there, and it just took a little time for you to figure it out. And that's how he talks about spirituality. But I think that's the most beautiful moments of creativity are that, when you can access that. So all of this was on the same residency, which was just magical. But the fact that, I mean, sometimes I'm like, I miss that so much because I feel so far away from it if my life is cluttered with lots of things and I can't see like straight through all of that. But then there are other times where you can go outside and find that in a blade of grass if you're just willing to look for it. So I try to remind myself that ability to see to get a glimpse of the universe, I guess is what you could call it, which in Hinduism we talk about Maya, which is the illusion, that life is the illusion, and that if you can just get past that, you can see the heart of everything and you can see the beauty in everything and the joy in everything. It's always there, like even in the most mundane suburban life you might be living. Right. It's always present. You just have to be willing to reach for it. I think that is that has changed my outlook on life. And I definitely forget about it sometimes. But when I'm grasping, when I'm feeling desperate, when I'm feeling, say, burnout or any of these things, just have to remember that is always within reach for us to be able to see beauty everywhere and to feel at rest, and just be in that moment.
That feels like the perfect segue to my next question, which has to do with this line in your bio that, I don't know, I feel like you could talk more about this in your bio, actually, not here to critique that, but that's why I'm going to ask about it. And that's this line you have about exploring identity, community, and joy with your music. And I'd love to break this down a little bit. How do you feel? Because you were just talking about like this, I don't know, I feel like you could talk more about this in your bio, actually, not here to critique that, but that's why I'm going to ask about it. And that's this line you have about exploring identity, community, and joy with your music. And I'd love to break this down a little bit. How do you feel? Because you were just talking about like this this really optimistic kind of worldview. I mean, how do these aspects manifest in your music?
Mm. So sometimes I can like categorize the pieces by these three things. Some of them have one label, some of them have two or more of the labels. I think identity is super important. I kind of laugh when politicians on one side or the other critique one of the parties for having identity politics when they all have identity politics. I think it's super important to know your identity labels and to know yourself. Those might be the same thing and those might be a little bit different. Understanding, I've talked about earlier in this discussion about knowing where I came from being very important to me, but also knowing how that makes people perceive me, helping me kind of remove the shackles of fear. It's an ongoing process, but like basically being less concerned about taking up space and less concerned about certain things. And also understanding that within the complex South Asian political and ethnic mix that I also have a lot of privileges, just like I've also grown up sometimes being a minority. So, I mean, knowing how all these things work definitely allows me to assert myself, to understand what is missing and what I need to do to go out for it and to hold on to it. So I really think it's really important for everybody to have that experience of identity, to knowing how the world identifies them and how you self-identify. I think both of those things are super important. With community is this incredible idea that is constantly morphing and forming in the world. And for me, my understanding of it, I'm just getting a glimpse of it, I really feel. Community has always been very important to me because I feel like I was raised by a community, not just my wonderful parents and family, but actually the whole community around me. We're an immigrant community. So community has often meant that people who are not my blood relatives are the ones picking me up after school if my family needed help with that or things like that. You know, my aunties and uncles, as we call them in South Asian communities, really, really important. I had an interesting and cool experience where I curated a huge event that was community oriented recently. And actually, it was my first time really realizing that community doesn't mean unity, that community doesn't mean that everybody's voices are exactly the same, which I think is something that I kind of knew, but I had always sort of put more in the identity category, if that makes sense, that communal experiences can have lots of viewpoints going on at the same time. And so, like I said, I'm just starting to encounter really what's all the hues of what community means. But with all that being said, I think it's still really important to gather, you know, even if it's a gathering and people are fighting with each other and disagreeing, which is what we have a lot of in the US. I mean, at least it's still a gathering. You know, I think we're still coming together. And some people say it's not a conversation unless you disagree with each other. I don't know if I fully buy into that thinking, but I'm learning. I thought I understood what community was, having grown up with a really strong sense of it and having missed it when I was elsewhere. And I'm just starting to learn, just scratch the surface of what all the things community can encompass and how can we as artists help gather community. I wouldn't put us as full-on community organizers. I think that's a sacred term, but I think that we've got a lot of power and responsibility. So how do we choose to draw the lines of who's invited into our space? And then joy, I think, is so important to remember. And I think it's maybe a little non-standard to talk about joy in an artist's bio. I think rightfully so, a lot of artist bios talk about process and like what goes into process. And I think that's incredibly essential. But for me, process feels like it's always evolving. I think the constant is joy, even in pieces that are not necessarily joyful in nature. I think I'm trying to keep the individual joy when I'm working. And I'm trying to, with the works I've written on, like that have, say, very serious topics to them, I am trying to think about the possibility that the future holds. I think I do have that optimistic worldview, even in some, I mean, I've told some pretty difficult stories. I've gotten the chance to do that with certain writers before. And I think that's my responsibility that I hold. I don't hold every artist responsible to do that, but I think my responsibility to myself is to be creating some possibility of joy in the experiences that we're trying to bring to life.
So these three things, identity, community, and joy, might not necessarily be just in a piece of music. I mean, it sounds like it could be in the experiences you create with music, maybe even from like a curatorial perspective.
I think definitely. And I think it's also possible that I might be approaching the piece with these three things in the first place. And they might not be part
Right.
of, I guess sometimes there's this idea that composer like plays God or whether it's a curator too, like this is the experience you're going to have. And not everybody will walk away with that experience. And that's what I love about those three markers for me is that my identity might not be what a person in the audience felt like resonate at all. My idea of creating community might have been a very different experience for a person in the audience's community. And my idea of joy might not leave them with joy. But I think I'm hoping that I'm asking them to think about those things and not just the notes that they heard, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So with all that we've talked about, I'm curious to know when you seek to write what you might perceive as experimental music, how do you do this or how do you think about it? Because I think some might argue that simply like blending the two types of the worlds that we've talked about, that could be seen as experimental in itself. But I mean, is it that or does it go beyond that?
For me personally, I think there has to be an element of the unfamiliarity, the unknown, and the fear that comes with it, which again is kind of a theme I keep coming back to, whether it's in one's travels and where one goes and explores, or what one does sonically in those kind of travel explorations. This is a really interesting world to me now that I want our creative sphere to talk more about, because I'm a very passionate advocate on topics of cultural appropriation and stuff. And I've written about this too in like resources for teachers who are trying to share with their students, but not necessarily do it in an appropriative way. Like I'm very passionate about that. But I'm also, I think that a lot of composers get their ideas from when they don't know as much about a place. Like they almost sonically imagine what it could be. And that might be a literal place or like a totally imagined place.
Yeah.
And I find that very interesting, that the not knowing can lead to ideas. And there's a gap. And I think it can very easily be a problematic thing too. And I think we've seen that historically. But I'm excited for a sort of approach that's informed about the perils of appropriating, but still wants to like imagine and still dream. I think there's still something really beautiful in that. So I suppose that's where experimentalism is really cool to me, because there is some amount of you trying out something that is unknown to you. And I don't always view the blending, as you say, as experimentation, because it in me and in many other people in this country, it lives kind of naturally already, those two things. At the same time, there are times where if I've sort of developed an approach and I've kind of harnessed it into its own thing, I feel like there is maybe some experimentation in that has resulted with it. So I suppose it's a mindset as well as an approach to like an attitude, I guess, that links into this curiosity thing that I was talking about. And I think the most important thing is that it is never done. Going back to what we discussed earlier, it can't be, if you're like confident in it, it's probably not experimentalism anymore.
Sure.
I don't know. That's my personal attitude towards experimenting.
No, I appreciate that. And that's why I asked like what your perception of it is, because, there's probably like among our community in contemporary classical music, there like experimental music has that's like a very specific thing.
Mm-hmm.
I was at a performance of a piece of mine last week, and I was asked to like get up and talk about it beforehand. And I made a comment about it that was like, this is like one of my more experimental pieces, but that's like experimental within the context of everything that I do. And it's just, it had like more aleatoric elements, microtones. Like I don't do that all the time. And so that's why I'm like curious, like what does this might be a question to ask everybody actually. What does experimentation mean to you? And
Yeah. I mean, I think that what you said at your concert last week, I think that really resonates with me, because sometimes when I've done things like that, it feels like I'm wearing an uncomfortable piece of shirt. It's kind of itches. Yeah. I'm nervous to share that kind of thing. Yeah, I think that has to be an ingredient. And I remember I have this piece Numbers, right, which you shared, which has become so normal to me because it's been performed a few times, and B, like it's something I looked back on a lot, and it just feels very familiar to me. But I remember the first time I shared it with my friend when I was mocking it up, I was like, what? Like, this is so weird, right? Like, this is so strange, this piece. And not only did she not find it strange, like she enjoyed it, she also, like, to her, it wasn't necessarily that experimental in the contemporary classical sense. But to me, it was uncomfortable for a while until it became comfortable. So maybe at a time in my life that was experimental, and now it's not, because I've done more things in that vein. But it was important for me to be experimental for that time. And I had to have something that was sort of unknown and kind of scary because of it.
Yeah, totally. And I'm always interested in like how those types of pieces lead to my own personal evolution in my compositional voice, which is exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. It led to a very normal path after it.
Yeah.
Normalized, I'll say. Maybe the path became normalized after it.
Yeah, I like that. Kind of heading into my final set of questions. These are questions I ask everybody, and I'll kind of start off with, what do you think you would be doing if it wasn't music, if it wasn't your art, being a composer, if it was totally out of the equation?
A few years ago, that answer would have been very easy. I think it would have been deep into the academia of I minored in cognitive science, but I was also pretty interested in like very specific history. So I think one of those two, it would have been like definitely like not in the real world, definitely like still trying to put that off as long as possible. Studying like something like that very deeply. But recently I did an exercise in a wonderful toolkit that's called How to Not Work So Much, or something like that.
I need that. I'm going to write that down.
I'll get you the full name after. And it was like, list all the things you do. And after I did that, I've had this workbook for a few years, so I basically did it again after a gap. And I then went and I wrote down all the like jobs that job titles I could hold, which included composer, engraver, arranger, performer, but also things like accountant and publicist. And now let's be clear, like things like graphic designer that I do, I don't necessarily do as well as other job titles that I hold. And there are other people out there who could do them much better. But it made me realize that I'm not actually, I think I always have this idea of like, because I've put off the real world before with academia, I have this sense that I'm not that closely linked to, say, business or other aspects of life that I actually am, and that actually we all are, and we just do them. We feel like art is in this beautiful wishy-washy land that's very far away from like tracking sales, for example. And it was uncomfortable to realize how close I am to capitalism. But also it made me realize that like I would probably have not, like there's a possibility I wouldn't have been in like, say, academia. I would have been, say, doing a trade or something very, very literal with very obvious results after. Like it just made me realize that as artists, we are in fact very much in lands that are not wishy-washy, very much in the concrete. And I guess as artists, maybe not well, but we could do a lot of things. Like so long as you're not assessing the results at the end, there's a lot of things we do already.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's something that we should all be talking more about, or I guess rather putting the blame on everyone. I'll say it's something that should just be part of the conversation more, like whether that's in school or among one another. I mean, it's such a, I mean, I remember like the day I started saving receipts for shipping scores, right? Like for tax purposes.
My gosh. Yeah. That was a big day. That was a big day in your life. I can believe it.
So is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from? And when I say tool, it could be, an actual object, or it could be something like a process that you kind of lean into that you really love.
So if it's okay, I'm going to share two, one for kind of makers in general and one that's very specific to composition. As you can tell, I do a lot of like self-help books. But like including this toolkit that I was just describing to you, I think this year I got the chance to work with a career coach, which was actually awesome, through the MAP Fund, which was fantastic. And I think I wish for every artist to have that chance. But even if you can't access like those kinds of coachings, I really think that self-reflection and these kinds of exercises and honoring the amount of time and work you put into something through, say, figuring out how much your time is worth, for example, like there are worksheets you can do on that. I think that's something that I wish for every maker to go through and experience. I think it takes time to do, and it can be another time-consuming aspect if you're worried about how your time is spent. But I think it is time well spent, because it is recognizing when we don't work in your job starts at this time, your job ends at this time kind of mind frame. If you're somebody who's working late into the night or whatever it is, you need to do these exercises to sort of be able to protect yourself and just understand where everything is going towards, and understand how hard you're working, and appreciate yourself for that. So that's one thing I love to do is, these self-reflection, self-help books, whatever they are. And then a tool I use that might be helpful for composers to talk about, and I never really talk about publicly enough, and I should, is that I use mock-ups a lot. Like the workspace of a digital audio workstation that's very messy. I'm not creating a finished product there at all.
Sure.
But it's something that I use to sort of dance around, that I'd be like, I use mock-ups, I use manuscript paper, I use written sketches, and I do use all those tools. But I think the one essential one I've had to come to accept is that I always have mock-ups. I'm still an oral musician very much, and it's going to be there in every piece in some shape or form. And so I just need to own it now and not be ashamed of that process, but be proud of it.
Yeah, totally. My final question is your chance to pretty much say whatever you want.
Which I've been doing this whole interview. So.
Which I've loved every second of, by the way. So thank you for that. But what is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
I think the mock-ups is one thing. For me to be transparent in the process. I think the not composing is as valuable as the composing. I don't know if you feel this as well. But it's a hard thing to accept and a hard thing to share. But if I'm ever talking to students or something, I should be sharing that more, because I think it's very common for us to talk about all the things we do, all the projects we put out. Sometimes it's alarming when we write the list of works, just how many things we've done, and realizing wow. But the slowing down, the time spent in other areas of life really do fuel the composing. And they shouldn't have to fuel. You could just also be able to just be. But I haven't been very good on this recently, but I try to go for mini adventures in my daily life, particularly if I'm not traveling or doing something cool. I try to once a week, I used to try to find something nearby me where I could just have a little adventure, do something out of the norm. And sometimes it feels very irresponsible to be doing this when I've got a lot of tasks that I need to complete. But I think that playing hooky, as it were, is super important, I find, to my creative brain. And a similar way I do that is sometimes I'll come up with a whole novel idea. And I'm not a writer. I'm not trying to be a published writer, but basically exercising my brain in something that's not going to result in a product that I'm going to then try to market and sell or something is so important for my well-being and for my composer life. Yeah. That's something I've not shared before publicly.
Well, I completely agree. And, a composition mentor of mine, he said in so many words that, as composers, we're always composing. We're always making art, because our art is influenced by everything we do. And so we should never feel guilty for doing other things, because it's part of the process, I
love that. I'm going to use it as a reason to go get a lot of ice cream this afternoon and luxuriate in it. So thank you.
Please do. Yeah. Well, Shruthi, this has been so much fun. I've loved getting to know you a little bit more, and just congratulations, first of all, on everything that you do. And thanks so much for taking some time to hang out today.
Thank you. And I'm so sorry that this was so long, but I just had so much fun talking to you that I went on forever. So thanks for letting me ramble.
Oh, no need to apologize. That's what this is for.
Thank you, Tyler.
And that, folks, is the perfect example of why I'm doing this podcast. Just getting to hear how Shruthi's whole life, really, and whole identity manifests in the music that she makes and all the non-musical stuff that goes into her work. It's just a really excellent perspective, in my opinion, and it's all the great stuff that I always hope to get to share with you. You can learn more about Shruthi and listen to her music by visiting her website. That's shruthirajasekar.com, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes. It's definitely worth checking out. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We are online at looseleaftransmissions.com, where you can find more episodes of the podcast and ways to support the podcast and network as well. All right, everybody, thanks again for listening, and I'll see you here next time for the next edition of Music Maker.